Uh, Now we come to news of of an ongoing nature. We've been talking an awful lot about the pandemic and its effect on our sector this year in the Watching Brief, and this particular iteration of this is the result of hundreds of thousands of students returning or going for the first time to university um, during a pandemic, and the result of that being, in several cases so far, an explosion of infection, and the requirement that students are locked in and locked down. And this is quite a complicated little story, but I think it's worthwhile touching on in so much as it reveals an awful lot about the context of so much of what archaeology and heritage is, and entertainment and culture is facing at the moment, and that is what happens when people come together in one place. In Glasgow, in Edinburgh, Manchester, and Newcastle now as well recently, we've seen students essentially being told to stay in their rooms and having, for example, food delivered to them. Actually, I saw a Greg's parcel being delivered on the news in I think Northumbria University a couple of days ago. Greg's being a local maker of pasties and sausage rolls. um, but it, I suppose, is this inevitable? Was this inevitable? Was this avoidable? Do you think enough was done to try and avoid some of this stuff? Because I'll just briefly put a little bit of my cards on the table, in so much as I've seen lots
Mm,
of friends and colleagues who teach at universities stressing for the past 6 months or more about how they're going to deliver their content, how they're going to actually teach students in a blended way, as it's called, online and in person if they
mm,
can. Um, but it doesn't feel as though necessarily some of the departments and some of the higher up um, umbrella elements of universities have been thinking carefully about the nuts and bolts of living in a university during pandemic. Uh, what are your thoughts? Obviously, you have a kid at uni at the moment, don't you?
well, just finished actually,
Oh, okay.
uh, uh, and his partner finished her postgrad law qualification during the pandemic.
Mm,
Second half, the first third of her teaching was fine. The second third of it was caught up in the lecturers' strike, and that's a separate issue.
mm,
And then the third of it, including her exams, were all done remotely because
mm,
of the pandemic.
mm,
Fortunately, her university uh, carried out the exams remotely. They changed the formats. She's got the qualification she needed, but it was touch and go for a while. And certainly the impact on uh, health and well-being of anybody I've seen in this area is considerable. So I think we start from that baseline that this is not easy stuff,
mm,
and I include the government in that. Actually, I'm seldom fair to the current government because they don't deserve it. But on the other hand, they are dealing with situations that are really about as serious as any politician, any decision maker is going to come across in their career, short of a physical shooting war.
mm,
And so, one has to bear that in mind when criticizing. At the same time, I think we also have to bear in mind the valid criticism that, for example, it is alleged there was pressure to send the universities back in physical terms, get students actually into the halls
mhm.
because of accommodation contracts with developers who had financial models that require maximum occupancy for the periods of term time.
Yeah.
And you know, so was that driving the decision making?
Mm,
Because technically, you can, as the Open University has proved, you can teach entire degree courses online even before the modern internet. That was possible, and the OU would have minimal face to face tuition.
this is this is
Um,
true. The Open University was set up in the 1960s to provide remote learning, and in that sense, it's kind of kind of business as usual for them. So we need to be a little bit generous when it comes to, in particular, switching teaching methods and styles over. Although, actually, incidentally, that's the link of the month, is it not? This month, I've included a link to a document that I was asked to put together for a local university, which anyone can use if they want to. There's some hints and tips on filming yourself and having useful footage for teaching and getting your own, letting your own personality come through as you're teaching, this kind of thing. So it's not. That's not really. It feels like I'm plugging. It's not really a plug. It's literally helpful information. So yeah, check that out if you want to. But anyway, Andy.
No, all I was going to say was really, I have got the utmost respect, and I have seen this very close to home in our own family,
Mm,
of the kind of stress that academics have been under in trying to recreate in weeks, not just viable courses, but viable courses using these kind of resources, which many of them haven't used before.
no.
In many cases, courses that are predicated on being face to face and hands on.
Hmm.
And also, and I think we mustn't forget this, not just providing the service to the education to the students. I hate that word, we shouldn't call it service, and they're not customers. They, uh, it is still a vocational thing. People choose to go to uni and people choose to teach. And
Well, they should at least.
well, they should at least,
No, no.
yes.
In so much as an awful lot is, again, as ever is the case when it comes to university stuff, an awful lot is talked about in terms of the university experience, and
Yes.
unfortunately, there has been a shift in recent years, certainly since I was at university,
Oh,
to,
commodification. Yeah.
towards a commodified learning experience where people do feel as though they're
Yeah.
entitled to what they're
Yeah.
quote unquote paying for, as
Mm.
opposed to working hard. But that's
But,
a
but,
that's a
but,
different, yeah.
but yeah, exactly. And the point I was going to make was that the academics and their support staff who are trying to deliver these courses
Mm,
aren't just about delivering 9.5 grand's worth of educational experience to the students.
mm,
They're also about creating a viable working environment for the staff teams and also making sure those staff teams are safe. And many of those members of staff will have been in categories of people who were, maybe with underlying health issues, who were being told to shield until relatively recently.
hmm.
So, there are huge health and safety implications through the whole 360 degrees of university life.
Mm,
It's not something that you can conjure out of just nowhere.
no.
What does concern me are, for example, the reports of really heavy-handed management in terms of staff being told this is what you shall do,
Hmm.
without any kind of consultation or cooperation.
Mm,
But also, there was a case, I think it was in Manchester, and I apologise if I got it wrong. Manchester Met, where it was alleged that illegal notices had been issued to students by the university management regarding the way they should behave,
yeah,
which actually went as far as a solicitor's letter to the university.
yeah.
Letter of,
Well, well, and in that
yeah,
instance, I believe the use of security staff as well has been
that
borderline a human rights violation, as it were.
that was a part. That was a part of it, and that was what
Yeah.
that was what the legal letter was about.
Mm,
We've also seen wonderful examples of the black humour.
mm.
We've had
Oh,
post-it
need
notes with
help? Send beer.
yes. Well, send beer and weed, I think, was one that I saw. And send food and weed. Sorry, and get your priorities right.
Now,
And
well, weed and
and also,
food.
that's right. And post-it notes spelling out HMP, Her Majesty's Prison.
Yeah, yeah. Mm,
In some of the lockdown halls. And again, I think I know you have too, but I've certainly through again family experience, but also people who work in health services and so on in our family. That the health and mental welfare issues in this are huge,
mm,
and particularly, for example, when you're dealing with young people who are probably living away from home for the first time, and then thrown into these utterly unreal situations where they're being told even by the government that they might not be allowed to go home even for
even
Christmas.
Christmas, yeah.
Um,
Now,
it's
there is a flip side to this coin. I
mm,
mean, we should add to that as well. Many of these kids or very young adults have also just come out of an education um, cluster, shall we say, cluster bomb
Mm. Yeah.
of their results being completely messed up by the government's response to the pandemic. So an awful lot of stresses going on, but also
Yes.
we should also emphasize this element of human rights has been brought into the conversation. I would also argue there's an element of responsibility as well, because you're right, there is something quite amusing about putting post-it notes on your window and asking for people to send help. But then again, we've also had stories coming out of, for example, Coventry, out of Manchester, out of Glasgow, locally
Mm.
in Newcastle, of students behaving incredibly irresponsibly, incredibly irresponsibly when it comes to their own safety and the safety of others. One
Mm.
story in the Metro, to highlight a Newcastle example, has a headline that students admit lying to break coronavirus law as they party in Newcastle. Now, again, this is a complicated matter in so much as lots of these people are away from home for the first time. But also they know the rules, hence they are lying. You don't
Mm.
lie ignorantly about this stuff. They're saying that they're in the same household when they're not. They're going into bars which are actually overpacked. In fact, we've had a couple of local bars have to shut down and have heavy fines from the council because of how they've not been managing the interior space very well. And then also when it comes to flat parties or floor parties in
Mm.
halls, students seemingly have gone a little bit wild. Now, the thing is, I get it. I mean, again, they're stressed. They've just come out of this utter
Mm.
farce of an exam period, and now they're at university and they may not be able to go home and see their families. If they're in university with a reading week, for example, not that mine had a reading week, but if they got that half
Yeah.
term, then they're probably not going to be able to go home for that, and maybe even for
Yeah.
Christmas. I understand that, and also that sense of essentially being a little bit invulnerable when you're 18 to 20. Just
And
nothing
also that sense of I'm paying 9.5 grand for this, so I'm gonna effing well enjoy myself.
precisely. I get it, but I
Mm.
think I feel a little bit as though because I know that students do watch Archaeosoup and Watching Brief.
Yeah.
I feel as though
Yeah.
we should emphasise that don't do that. Just don't do it. It's not worth the hassle of getting ill, frankly, and also it's not worth it in terms of risking people's lives. I mean, the other university in Newcastle is called Northumbria University, and over the weekend it was revealed that more than 700 students had tested positive for coronavirus. More than
Mm.
700. That's the biggest spike, I believe, outside of the capital in
Yeah.
um, in the country, and 70 odd of which were showing fairly serious symptoms,
Yeah.
which is also an interesting another whole interesting part of this is that in that sense 90 up to 90%, I think the figures so far from testing show around about 80% of people will be asymptomatic,
Yeah.
which kind of brings me back to this question of, having just underscored, don't do that, please.
Yeah.
Brings us back to this question of how can universities, how can archaeological units, how can museums and theatres and galleries handle this situation when 8 out of 10 people who have it might not know they even have it? Most of the advice is
Well,
around the notion of if you're
yeah.
symptomatic, get a test, for example.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know,
Okay. Right. And this is where we have to lay this absolutely at the door of the government,
mm,
because all the academic advice that, apart from the outliers who say that the whole threat's being overstated, da 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 da, and
mm,
we can we can note those objections. At the
mhm,
moment, that they are in no sense the majority of health authorities, including organisations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, and so on.
mm,
So, ignoring that for a second, the overwhelming advice is that you solve a pandemic like this by identifying symptomatic people and then tracking and tracing their contacts, so that they can be isolated and individual outbreaks can therefore be contained and not spread into the wider community.
mm,
The UK government, governments like South Korea, the Taiwan, Japan, New Zealand, have, by a combination of isolation and tracking and tracing, kept the outbreaks in their areas very small, relatively to the general population. Other countries, notably the United States and Great Britain, have done immeasurably worse. The British government has spent billions, literally billions, on trying to create from nothing a privately directed, high-tech track and trace effort, which has failed dismally. That to the extent that they had to reinstate a third of positive cases that have been lost just this week, because they were using Excel as a database rather than proper database software at some point in the system. Now that is just sheer incompetence.
Yeah. Well, apparently they were also using columns and not rows to sort cases. They were using the database incorrectly in terms of good data management anyway. But anyways, that's
any archaeologist who's done database work will have come across things like SPSS and so on. If you and I could tell them, I'll bung you my invoice for 12 million quid, Matt Hancock.
I'll do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the government has to carry a lot of responsibility for this. And perhaps one of the more predictable things in the year is that university terms start at the beginning of October. So I think there's been other things in play in this country. For example, mixed messaging. 1 week the government is saying go out to work and go out to eat, and another week the government is saying work from home if you can again. Or work from home unless you can't again. So, and that's before we get on to trips to castles in your neck of the woods for eye tests.
So do you think then, because going back to this question of what departments and university level institutions and other public facing places where people will meet could do about or could have done about this, how much empathy or sympathy do you have for some of these universities in terms of what's happened, in so much as it looks as though, so the other day I was talking to Dr. David Petts, and obviously he teaches at my old university at Durham. And don't make the Pink Panther joke. Durham. I can't get it out of my head now. It's so annoying. But anyway, he teaches there, and it seems as though, without going into specifics, it seems as though they are keeping a close eye on what's happening elsewhere and attempting to not fall into the same pitfalls. Do you think it's just the case, to a certain extent, it was inevitable that the first ones back were going to have big problems, or do you think actually that they've had a long time to prepare for this and they should and could have done better? The more we talk about this, the less convinced I am of either position, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. Look, okay, this is a historical show. Okay, we talk about history and archaeology and heritage. Anybody who studies history and has had any contact with medical history at all, or even recently just reading background articles about the pandemic, will know that the phrase quarantine comes from the 40-day quarantine that was imposed in the Middle Ages on some arriving ships because of things like the plague. Quarantine. This is not new medical practice.
No.
The baseline for isolating pandemics is keeping people who are infected apart from people who aren't. So to that extent, nobody has any excuse for not preparing. What certainly once it was clear that there was this new highly contagious infection that, while most people are either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, is a killer for more people. Actually, again, call it out when it's when it's misinformation. The President of the United States tweeting the other day, or saying on camera the other day, that it's less, it kills fewer people than flu. That is not true. And certainly the way it has the potential to overwhelm health facilities, and particularly intensive care facilities, it is not it's not something that can be waved away.
Mm.
Unless you're prepared to see large swathes of the population die with very little medical intervention. I'm not.
And
So
so in that context, are you suggesting then that such places as universities should see themselves as the first buffer between the public and allowing local hospitals, or even in some cases their own teaching hospitals, to become overwhelmed?
well, the thing is, I think, in complex modern societies with very mobile populations, it has all these innovations. They rely on leadership and resources coming from the top.
Mm.
A modern city legally and physically can't do what the Derbyshire villages of Eyam did in 1665 and isolate themselves and let the plague run its course within their quarantine zone.
Mm.
That's just not possible.
I mean, maybe Norfolk. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, people of Norfolk. I'm sorry. I love you.
Pretend that comment hasn't happened. In all seriousness, yeah, and God, we need to find some laughs in the current situation, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, unless governments nationally and internationally get a handle on this, it is going to become endemic. And we're going to have to learn how to live with it. And that's an ongoing conversation. But at the moment, it's still possible within national boundaries to at least control the spread, if not eliminate entirely. But while I think, again, I would be very critical of certain university bodies for the way they've handled this. And I mean, just this morning I was reading an item where it was alleged that one university had countered accusations that students had been locked down in hall with no access to food by supplying them with food, but then charging them £17 a day for the privilege, which when you're on a student loan is, I don't know how much you as a family spend on food a day. We probably don't spend that amount.
Probably not. No.
No.
I mean, obviously, sometimes we do like the we put gold leaf on our toast and stuff like that.
Put it this way, I don't think the food parcels that the students are being sent included bottles of prosecco.
No.
Or even bottles of cans of Red Stripe or whatever. That's clumsy. And it speaks to people who are interested more in the bottom line than in the welfare of their charges,
And so I mean, this segment has gone on for a while now, and I think we should think about drawing it to a close. But I suppose what we could say then, as part of this ongoing coverage of COVID and how it's affecting the sector, in particular archaeology and archaeology students in this case, is that to a certain extent this was probably inevitable. You as a student, if you are at university, shouldn't add to the problem as far as possible in terms of be a responsible citizen and a responsible colleague to your friends and colleagues. But also that this is something hopefully we can learn from quickly, and within a month or so it shouldn't be a problem, hopefully.
I'll make one point, and this is one maybe for our colleagues who are into sociology and medical history and so on might have some ideas and thoughts about, and maybe would want to contribute below the line to our discussion.
Our meagre understanding.
Our meagre understanding, absolutely. But I lived through the origin and the trajectory of the HIV/AIDS pandemic from the early 1980s, and I was working in an industry at the time where many people, I lost colleagues and friends to AIDS, HIV, as did other members of the family. But that has now become, although AIDS still exists and is still a huge problem in parts of the world, it is much more controllable and multiple. It's survivable and livable with.
Mm.
because of a combination of two things: medical research,
Mhm.
which has vastly improved the treatments and prophylactics that are available.
Mhm. Mhm.
But the second one is the initiatives that came from the bottom up, particularly from the gay community in the beginning, when everybody else was ignoring it,
Mm.
who were starting charities and starting educational programs and to influence behavior and to self-help.
Mm.
And whether COVID is the kind of disease infection that will go the same way, we don't yet know. It's too soon. It's only been around for less than a year that we know of.
Mhm.
Certainly in the human reservoir. But there are maybe lessons, and particularly for people in communities like student halls and so on, to get together and say to themselves, okay, what do we need to do to make ourselves and the people around us safe? How can
Mm.
we, from the ignore, what can we do independently of anybody else? Because no, push comes to shove, they either can't or can't be asked, or regard it as too expensive. But what can we do for ourselves? And that
Mhm.
might be one of the ways forward.
Okay.